Hello, everybody. This is Susan Heaton-Wright from Superstar Communicator. You will see that my sidekick, Nick Simon, the co-presenter, isn't here today. He's obviously got something far better to do. So apologies, Samuel. This is nothing about you. It's about his other work. So today, we are absolutely honoured. I mean, this is absolute royalty on the podcast and the live stream. This is Samuel Kamuzu, award-winning social entrepreneur, commentator, and strategist. He served as special advisor to Prime Minister Boris Johnson, where he held the Civil Society and Communities Brief. His work included leading on the cross-government vaccine deployment confidence program. He's the most senior Black advisor in government and was running to become the next mayor of London. And he's been involved in setting up and growing a number of initiatives to support the progression of Britain's Black and minority ethnic population. This includes setting up a student network connecting peers with employers whilst at university that grew to 30,000 members. That's the size of a big university. It is. He went on to set up and run a campaign that supported over 8,000 startup businesses and has won numerous awards, including Barclays Business Enterprise Award, Spirit of London Awards, Entrepreneur Champion of the Year, Great British Entrepreneur Awards, and many more. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Susan. Thanks for having me. Thanks for that warm introduction. I should take you everywhere with me, Susan.
I beg your pardon?
I should take you everywhere with me.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I'm happy to send it on to you. So I heard you speak and was bowled over when you spoke at the Institute of Internal Comms here in Welwyn. And then I realised that you are a local councillor for the Welwyn Hatfield borough. Aren't we lucky? But what made you go into politics?
That's a good question. I got involved in politics when I was 19, and it started off as student politics. So I was the president of a society on my campus, as the largest at the time, and I wanted to do an event, and the student union tried to prevent me from doing the event. So I decided to run to be the vice president of the union. I had no idea what the union did. Besides blocking me from doing events, and then I managed to get a record number of votes for a contested seat. I mean, I got 1,000 votes, and it wasn't because I knew what I was doing or because I had a great plan. It was just because I was quite a passionate voice, and literally my slogan was "Vote for a passionate voice," because that's all I had at the time. And so as I get involved in student politics, I got involved in the National Union of Students, where most of the people were Labour members and some were members of Parliament now. And that's really how I got involved. So it's a bit of an accident, probably I'd say.
But I wonder if people voted for you because you're a very authentic person, and meeting you and hearing you speak at the conference, I certainly felt that I trusted you.
As a 19-year-old, did people vote for me? Yeah, perhaps.
Maybe.
But just probably primarily because they knew me and I wasn't like some of the other candidates. I had my own constituents of students who probably like me weren't very engaged in student politics, but because like they knew who I was and that I decided to run, they were like, well, I don't quite understand what you're doing here, but sure, fine, we'll vote for you.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. But your journey has been from that to ending up at number 10 as an advisor. I'm sure, I mean, I don't want you to go into details, but I'm sure that people would be interested about one or two things that you've learned from working in number 10.
Okay, yeah. So I one or two things I've learned. First is that power is very, very highly concentrated in the center of government. Ministers can't announce policies, as you can imagine, without it being signed off by number 10. And in fact, very often the ministers are announcing policies that were dreamt up in Downing Street. Ministers can't give speeches without it being first cleared by number 10, or ministers can't approve budgets without it being certainly passed by number 11, as people are going to be reading about or listening to today. And so power is highly concentrated. And then the second thing I would say I probably learned was that incredibly privileged people are not necessarily the smartest people, but are just the ones with the most access. And so very often, I found folks who were confident enough to walk through those doors and to try and demand things simply because they were privileged, and not necessarily because they had the best ideas. And so, we still live in a world where the same people are regurgitating themselves behind the corridors of power, and that doesn't necessarily change via changing a government, because I think we will probably find that even if we have a new prime minister, which is very likely next year, the same privileged people will still have the same type of access. And so, there a lot more needs to be done to get ordinary folks into positions where decisions are being made.
Now, what do you mean by privilege? Is it that those people have got a huge network so that they are recommended for roles and have access to people's ears?
Yeah, not necessarily a huge network, the right network. And also maybe the certain types of upbringing. Maybe you went to a certain school, or you study at a particular university. If you look at the Labour and Conservative front bench, I know that you will find that there are some folks on both sides who went to school with each other. Yeah. So, as much as they might wear a different rosette, they're basically, from the same place, not necessarily the same perspectives, but certainly they're the contemporaries. And so you have a lot of the same. And very often those people, maybe they trust individuals more who have the same background, right? And so it's not an accident that for a lot of the last 15 years we've had old Etonians or folks who study PPE at Oxbridge, being the ones who are chosen for key roles, and not just for key roles in the cabinet, so not just people that but also people behind the corridors of power who are making some of the big decisions. They will give examples, but it's very clear. If you just look beneath the bonnet, still very privileged folks are the ones who are in charge.
I experienced that. I mean, I went to university well before you did, but I went to, I'm going to say it, Durham University.
It's good uni.
Yeah, nice middle class girl. But because I was not from the South, and because I wasn't from one of those so-called elite schools, I was a social experiment to some of those people.
Yeah. And I mean, we now have a member of parliament from the North, I think is the party chairman, who is has a seat at the table in the cabinet. But before we had the Tories had a new chair, there was no Northern member of parliament sitting at the cabinet. Imagine that. I mean, there was one technically, which is the Prime Minister, because his seat is in the North, but he's from Southampton, so I'm not going to give him that pass. And so we still have huge challenges around regional representation. Jobs are still going to the boys, and even if it going to the girls, those girls are usually quite privileged too. Yes. And so big challenges, and that just means we have to redouble our efforts to try and make sure that we're breaking those barriers, and we're not accepting this idea that actually folks who are different are not as good, because that's just for the birds.
Absolutely. And you wrote an excellent book on the power of the outsider. What is your definition of an outsider?
Good question. Good exam question. So outsiders mean different things to different people from different backgrounds and different contexts. And so what I found was after I left Downing Street, I wanted to go on this journey of discovery to try and really understand my experiences in that building, but also to try and create a blueprint for folks who may have entered a space for the first time and may feel like they might be an outsider. And what I found was that there are different types of outsiders. So you could be an outsider based on what people would call an objective fact. I don't know, your gender, the color of your skin, where you grew up, the football team you support. These are relatively objective facts, right? So social or demographic outsider. You could also be an outsider because of a psychological reason. So, you might look and sound like everybody in the room, but there might be a reason why you think that you are different or why you believe you're different. That could be because you're an introvert or in a room of extroverts, or it could be because you were the one in your family that people might say is not the academic one. Or it could be because you suffered some kind of trauma growing up, and many people may never know that trauma, but a discussion is sparked in a room where everybody seems relatively similar, and for that reason you feel excluded or like an outsider. Or it could be because you suffer from dysphoria. So there are reasons why you could be an outsider and nobody might think you are, but you might feel like you are. And then there's your tactical outsider. So that's your outsider that separates themselves from a majority or dominant group in order to achieve some form of advantage, or because of disdain for a particular set of principles or worldview. So, for example, Nigel Farage, who is now eating weird stuff in Australia, in I'm Celeb, he is from a privileged background, was a banker, friends with Rupert Murdoch. In many respects, you would say he's your example of an insider, but he separates himself tactically and positions himself as an anti-establishment outsider in order to secure what he believes was right for the country, which is to leave the European Union. And actually, there may be even some broader reasons why he decided to go down that route. And so those are three types of outsider. You could be tactical, you could be a demographic or social outsider, and you could be a psychological. What brings them all together? And my definition of an outsider is somebody that is set apart for a purpose. So there's a reason why you were different. That's what makes you an outsider.
And the title of your book is The Power of the Outsider. So let's twist this round. You let us know about the three different definitions. Why can they be powerful?
Yeah. So the thing is, no matter what kind of outsider you are or you think you are, the one thing that I believe is that there is a value that your outsiderness can bring. And so your tactical outsider, who is not necessarily always somebody that's privileged, but can be someone that's quite privileged, will use it tactically because they recognize if I separate myself from a dominant or majority group, I'm going to be able to be more distinctive. I'm going to be able to mobilize people in a different way. I'm going to be able to maybe be more disruptive than if I was as monolithic as my background might suggest. And so no matter what type of outsider you are, you can use it as a superpower in order for you to either seek out some form of advantage, but also, for good. And so that's why the title is The Power of the Outsider.
But the challenge can be that you are an outsider and you're not being listened to. You're not able to push through and influence. I use the example of, we've got the COVID, the COVID analysis going on at the moment, and there was a very senior civil servant that was struggling to be heard and listened to, without going into names or details. How would you suggest that person or a similar person could push through all of the noise and perhaps the microaggressions that go with that?
I'm not sure which civil. I mean, there's 400,000 civil servants. I'm sure they would all probably argue that they probably
this was a very senior one.
Struggle to be listened to. But I would say that the challenge for an outsider is twofold. One is to recognize that there is a value in your difference, and then the second is to be able to, I guess, utilize or maximize the output of that value. And so the first part is quite internal, and the second part has external factors and so, for example, if people are very used to a particular type of person where decisions are being made, and so if you're an outsider, then actually there might be some biases that you have to try and overcome.
Yes.
And so, but the challenge is still that you have to respond to it with a bunch of principles. In politics, it's how do you build a network of allies? How do you communicate the value that you bring, all the things that you want to achieve in a way that allows you to really push the dial? What is the clarity of the vision? And sometimes actually, am I in a place where I'm genuinely going to be able to flourish? Because, at times the reality is that you might have to say, oh, actually, I've exhausted all avenues, and this is probably not going to be the place where I'm going to bloom. And so, there are definitely external factors. But some of those principles, whether you're an insider or an outsider, and how you can navigate those spaces are pretty universal. You're not going to be able to, really affect change in a working environment or in politics, etc., if you're not able to understand the politics of human behavior. And that is ultimately the challenge for a lot of people.
So you mentioned about allies. What are your tips for building a network of allies?
Good question. I suppose the first thing I would say is you got to know what you bring to the table, because if you don't believe in your own source, then why should you expect anybody else to? Firstly. Secondly, you have to make sure you're a thought leader in your space. So whatever it is that you bring to the table, make sure that you've mastered it, not just from an implicit perspective, but also quite explicitly. Have you written about the space where you're an expert? Have you studied it in a way that is gone into some great depth, right? So how are you demonstrably a thought leader? And then I suppose the first thing I would say is how are you building and maintaining relationships? So we all have LinkedIn and we're on the platform now, and that's a great place of demonstrating you're a thought leader, but it's not necessarily the only way that you should assume you can build and maintain relationships. So you need to get out there, and also you need to be helpful. Right?
Yes, people get the helpfulness. Yeah. You
got to be helpful. If people remember you, they think you can help them along the way, and the best way to demonstrate that is by being proactive and being useful. It's just there are principles, as I keep saying, that are universal, and it's not just about how you deal with some of the external barriers. It's also about how you make sure you're positioned in a way that even if folks don't like you, and even if folks are not necessarily keen to have you around, you want to be in a position where people will struggle to not have you around, and you need to be in a position where people need what you're selling, essentially.
Really, really good tips there. Now, we've talked about somebody or us being an outsider, someone being an outsider. How about if you are a leader of a team or an organization? Do you have tips for how you can make sure that everybody feels that they belong, that they are of value, no matter what their background is, what they look like, how they speak?
Yeah, I suppose the first thing I would say is cultures need to be both explicit and implicit. And what I mean by that is when you walk into an office, even though a lot of people work from home now, but when you walk into an office, you should be able to feel the culture that you want, and also it should be very explicit, and so are your values on the wall? Do you have a culture statement? Is there a way of behaving that if a new person was coming today, they would be reasonably expected to recognize is the standard? And then values can be actual, aspirational. And so you can say, look, we want to be a really inclusive environment. We want to focus on excellence and teamwork, and et cetera, et cetera. And so they could be values that people will say you're achieving now, but they also should have some stretch attached to it. So you can constantly ask yourself, are you heading in the right direction? Where is there room for improvement? So cultures don't get set by accident. And that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that it's important to recognize that you don't all have to agree for you to be part of a cohesive team. And so, you have to embrace diversity of thought, and you need to make sure that you have an environment where it's safe enough for people who might have doubts about particular discourses to be able to raise some concerns, and for people to be able to agree to disagree respectfully.
Yes.
That's really important. And I suppose the third thing I would say is, cultures, values, etc., always flows from the head down. And so it is for the leader to set the tone, to recognize that they are the ones that will predetermine what is acceptable. If the CEO is behaving in a particular way or disregarding particular perspectives, then that will give license to other people to do the same thing. And so it's very important that the leader of any organization or institution is the one that is the first to say, this is how we want to do business.
So why should an organization spend time and probably money and energy into making sure that everybody feels included? What are the benefits to the company or organization?
Well, firstly, it makes business sense. We're in tough economic times, but there's also scarcity of talent, particularly in some of the roles where you need specific types of expertise. And so, it makes no sense for you to not be in a position where people from all walks of life will feel like you're a good place to work. And so it makes business sense. And also, if you want to retain talent, not just recruit talent, then you need to be in an environment where people feel like they can flourish regardless of what background they're from. And so it just makes business sense. And then the other thing I would say, or linked to it making business sense, is obviously we live in a country that is becoming increasingly diverse. Tomorrow, we will have the latest migration data published by the Office for National Statistics. It's very likely to show that there have been record levels of migration into Britain again. And regardless of what your views are on the subject, it still points to the fact that even if you close all the borders tomorrow, Britain will never look the way that it has done in the past. And so for you to remain relevant, particularly if you're in an urban centre, you're going to need to be able to engage with people from all walks of life in a meaningful way. And so there were just very basic imperatives, and that's not even with me touching on some of the moral arguments around why it's a good thing.
So you are a councillor in Welwyn Hatfield, in the Hatfield villages. So I presume that's Essendon and those villages, if I'm right, or maybe it's not.
No, but keep going.
But what are you bringing to the local borough with your mindset?
What am I bringing? That's a good question. So the average age of a councillor is not my age, probably two times my age. And so, we know that locally there are big issues around, how you get more young people to engage in politics. So I would say, I suppose I bring a relatively young perspective to some of the decision-making processes. I'm also quite an inclusive person, so I'm not very partisan. And so I get along with folks from different political parties, which is maybe a good way to do politics. Someone said to me the other day, before you and a few others were elected, the way that we did politics here was very partisan, and things have changed since you've come in. So I suppose I do politics a slightly different way. But I don't know. You'd have to ask my residents if I bring anything else to the table.
We've got a question from Dan Newton, who says, hello, great session. I don't know if you know Dan.
Yep, good man.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for hosting. Are there one or two things that you think are typically misunderstood about outsiders? Brilliant question. Thanks, Dan.
One or two things that I think are typically misunderstood. Yeah, I would say, good question. I would say the first thing is that people assume that being an outsider is a bad thing. But both outsiders and maybe even insiders. But yeah, this idea that, oh my goodness, because I'm an outsider, it is a negative disposition. And so, as I said, often the tactical outsiders who can often be from quite privileged backgrounds, so the ones that have cottoned on to the fact that it is very often, or more often than not, an advantage if it can be used and utilized in a way that it's a superpower, right? And so sometimes groups that are also quite marginalized don't realize that actually my difference is a strength. If I can get that sense of confidence in it, other people will also buy into that confidence. I'd say that's the first thing. And then the second thing I would say is that very often when people try to understand how we behave as human beings, the psychology behind our behaviors is not fully understood. And so if somebody is, I don't know, behaving in a way that is discriminatory, there is always this assumption that maybe it just means they're a bad person. Or maybe it's because they haven't checked their privilege, etc., etc., etc. When actually human behavior is a lot more complex than that. And so the psychology that underpins how we behave, both as outsiders but as human beings more broadly, is not often fully understood. And linked to that, actually being an outsider is quite a universal feeling. And so, the other day I was, because I'm on this book tour, went to speak at an event in Brixton. I mean, the week before I was in like Ilkley in York, so that was a very different type of setting. And then I was in Brixton in South London, and there was the lady who was hosting the event. She did this activity where she got people to stand up if they had ever experienced certain types of outsiderness. And so she said, stand up if you've ever felt like an outsider because of the color of your skin. And the majority of the people in the room were African and Caribbean. And so most people stood up. And then the people who were white, which were in the minority, didn't stand up. And then I thought to myself, well, actually, at this very moment, you probably feel like a bit of an outsider, even though maybe you'd never had that experience before. And so it was just like, actually, that feeling is quite universal, and it can happen to anyone from any walk of life at any moment. That doesn't necessarily mean that the outcomes of that feeling is homogenous. It's not. And there are moments where actually being an outsider has much more of a detrimental impact,
yes,
because of certain variables. But nonetheless, the understanding of the phenomena helps all of us to be able to navigate moments a bit better.
Brilliant. Dan, do you have any other questions, or is there anybody else that has a question that they'd like to ask? Because Samuel, I'm sure, will answer. But in the meantime, what 3 tips can you offer the audience on how to welcome an outsider? So if you have an outsider that perhaps moves in next door or joins your, I don't know, football club, how can you, ways that you can welcome them?
Good question. I think the first thing I would say is that we are all naturally disposed to gravitating towards that which is familiar. So we all like being around the thing that we're used to, people that we're used to, cultures that we're used to. So that is universal. Obviously, the more privileged or more senior a person is, the more material an impact you have on others because of that natural disposition. And so the first thing we have to do is recognize that and be proactive about building bridges and engaging with folks that might be different to ourselves. So if somebody is new to your football club, then you need to make sure that actually you're proactive and engaged into the fold. So that's the first thing, be proactive about including people. Second thing I would say is, again, make sure your values are quite explicit. Make sure certain things are just very clearly not acceptable. Certain types of jokes or certain behaviors. Making sure that people recognize that actually in this environment, we want to make sure that everybody feels that they can flourish, and therefore there are standards that must be upheld. And then the third thing is, try to make sure that people have a sense of purpose and a sense of direction in terms of where you want to go, and make sure people can feed into that. people, different voices, different levels. And, you know, when I define outsiders, I often say it's not just about majority versus minority, because sometimes actually the dominant group might not be the majority. And so it's not just about the numbers, it's also about who's in the positions of power. Of course, you know, relatively few people go to fee-paying schools. I think it's about 7% of the population. And so technically, but then that 7% dominate, you know, where decisions are being made. So they're not the dominant group. And so it's important to recognize the nuances around that. But yeah, it's just important to be intentional ultimately about how you include people.
So your book, The Power of Outsider, tell me a little bit about it and how people can purchase it. You're right there.
Yeah. So in fact, I've got some water. Let me just drink that. Yeah. So yeah, I left Downing Street, went on this journey of discovery over a two-year period, and I went across the country and to different parts of the world, interviewing people who I felt had a fascinating story, relatable story, and not necessarily your traditional cliche folks. Classical musician, a family of classical musicians, police and crime commissioner, former chairman of Sainsbury's, a real mix of fascinating people. And so I asked them questions, and then I was able then to reflect on my findings to craft what I hope is quite a meaningful book. And also there was some stuff around Downing Street because people like to ask me about Downing Street. So
yeah, I've been very diplomatic.
For people to feel like, yeah, thank you for that. Often people are not so diplomatic, but yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, so hopefully it's a really readable book.
I've just lost you for a moment. Oh, hopefully he'll come back while we're waiting. That was, well, we're just waiting for this because let me, oh dear. We've lost him for a moment and I'm sorry about this, everybody. But hopefully we will get him back. Maybe if I'll remove him from stage and then see if I can add him to, no, I can't add him to the stage. So I'm sorry about that. But what I would say is that you can purchase The Power of the Outsider. What I will do is that I will put a link through to his a site where you can get books so that you can purchase his books. And I'm hoping, oh, he is. Are you here again now? Can you hear me? Hello, Samuel, can you hear me?
Yes, I don't know what happened.
Yes, there was, for some reason you went dead. So I'm telling everybody how they can purchase your book. Are you able to hear me? Oh, don't know what's going on here. Can you hear me, Samuel? No. I really wanted to ask one more question, and that was related to what your next plans are. Can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me? I can hear you, but you can't hear me. Yeah, he's gone. So thank you very much, everybody. If you do hear any more and you want to ask some more questions, please put them in the live stream, the questions, and I'll ask Samuel to answer them. So thank you very much.